Hello to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and Facebook, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Browne, and I'm happy to be co-hosting our first Off the Hill of 2023 with my co-host, Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Nick is filling in for my regular co-host, Libby Davey, who's off sick tonight, unfortunately, so we wish Libby a speedy recovery. As usual, I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
And I'm joining from Cornwall, Ontario, the unceded territory of the Mohawks of Akwesasne.
All right, well, we're very glad to be launching another year of great Off the Hill panels. And if you want to be sure to be invited to future panels, just sign up for Rabble's free weekly newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And we have a great panel to kick off 2023. First, my pleasure to welcome back Leah Gazan. Hey, Leah. Leah is a member of parliament for Winnipeg Centre. She's currently the NDP critic for children, families, and social development, as well as the deputy critic for immigration, refugees, and citizenship. Leah is a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, located in Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory. Leah is a regular guest on Off the Hill, and we're very glad to have you to join us again tonight, Leah. And welcome to the panel, Jim Stanford. Hey, Jim. Jim is an economist and the director of the Centre for Future Work, a labor economics research institute with operations in Canada and Australia. He previously served as economist and director of policy with Canada's largest private sector union, Unifor. So welcome, Jim. A very special welcome back, actually, to Clayton, Thomas-Müller. Hey, Clayton. Clayton is a member of the Treaty 6 based Matthias Cologne Cree Nation, also known as Pukatawagan, located in northern Manitoba, Canada. Based in Winnipeg, he has been recognized by Yes Magazine as a climate hero and is featured as one of 10 international human rights defenders in the National Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Clayton is an award-winning film director, media producer, organizer, facilitator, public speaker, and best-selling author of Indigenous and Environmental and Economic Justice. Welcome, Clayton. And as always, it's a pleasure to welcome back Karl Nerenberg. Hey, Karl, Rabble's award-winning senior parliamentary correspondent. And a special welcome also to everyone who registered for this event on Zoom. Please participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, and we will do our best, as always, to address your questions. And finally, for those of you watching on Facebook, hello, a reminder that if you'd like to participate in future events, simply sign up to Rabble's free newsletter to get a new notification for the Zoom invite. Just go to rabble.ca/subscribe. And now I'll turn it over to Nick to get things started.
Thanks, Robin. So in just a few days, Canada's 45th Parliament and its MPs from 338 ridings from across the country will be back to work in Ottawa. There is no lack of critical issues that need attention and action. In this first Off the Hill 2023, we've brought together a fantastic panel. We're going to focus on the very related issues of the economy and the climate emergency. So let's begin. I'm going to ask Jim Stanford to give us a bit of an overview of the economy. Jim, what do economic conditions look like for working people in the months ahead? Who are the winners and who are the losers? And secondly, what do you expect to see playing out in Parliament?
Thank you very much, team. Thank you, Nick and Robin, for the invitation to join you. It's going to be a wild and woolly year in the economy. There's no doubt about it, and the repercussions will be felt politically. Economists are agreed that there almost certainly will be a recession of some kind in Canada in 2023, and shared in most other major industrial countries, including Europe and the US. The only question really is what kind of a recession it's going to be. The Bank of Canada believes it's going to be a soft landing, that wonderful utopian concept where they've managed to just kind of slow the economy to a stall for a few months, allow the economy to sort of catch its breath, and then carry on into the future. And they think that, number one, this will bring inflation down, that prospect of a soft landing, just slowing everything down for a bit, chilling it out for a while, if you like. And then number two, economic growth will just kind of magically continue, all the better because of getting inflation under control. That seems a bit far-fetched. It's not impossible, but it is unlikely. And based on the historical experience, we're more likely to see another type of recession, a much worse, more painful and lasting recession, a hard landing, if you like, or a real downturn. The precedents for this, Nick, are from the early 1980s and the early 1990s. Those were the last times we tried to reduce the rate of inflation by as much as we're trying to do it now. They're trying to bring inflation from 8%, where it was last June, to 2%, which is their preferred magic target. 6-point difference in inflation is a big difference. And we tried that in the early 80s, and we tried it again in the early 90s, both times using the same hammer. Much higher interest rates as a way to slow down the economy and reduce price pressures. And both times we had a wicked recession, not just a soft landing, a pause for breath, but a situation where over a 1 to 2 year period, the economy actually shrank. The amount of output declined, the number of people working fell. That seems to me to be more likely. And we've got lots of evidence. Perhaps I'll share a link to some of what we've reported, that the domestic economy is already shrinking. Never mind the soft landing, and we're going to see more negative numbers in the months ahead. In that situation, we're likely looking at 300,000 to 400,000 job losses in Canada. That's very, very painful. Unemployment shooting up to 9%, perhaps even higher. And then the political ramifications for our discussion tonight, terrible. Pierre Poilievre is obviously out there rampaging on about how Justin Trudeau and the Bank of Canada have printed too much money and spent too much money, and this is why we're in a mess. His storyline is absolutely false. This is a global problem, not a Canadian problem. In fact, inflation in Canada has been relatively mild compared to most other countries. But he's got a head of steam. And if we have a recession where people lose their jobs and experience real hardship, the thing that keeps me at night is that he would cash in on that. He'd get a big group of disaffected people agreeing with him, and then we all know how dangerous his agenda is. So, this is where it's all the more important for the NDP to be pushing back, to have an alternative narrative about what's happened, and I think they've done a good job at that, and an alternative vision for how to fix it or prevent a recession and care for Canadians. And hopefully that can at least educate Canadians about what the true problem is and what some better solutions would be.
Wow. All right. Thank you, Jim. Let's go to Clayton. Clayton, all right. So Jim spelled out clearly that there's some rough economic times coming for a lot of people. Still, on top of that, there's the ongoing climate emergency and the resulting floods, fires, and ravaging storms as we continue to rely on a carbon-fueled economy. Where does Canada sit right now with its environmental goals and commitments? And are we falling further behind? And is climate justice possible?
Well, I think it's certainly hard to be optimistic with the current political and economic landscape, conflict the world over. It really seems like the voices of those most impacted by the existential threat of climate change and recession, continue to face erasure in the national discourse. And I think that can be best, best shown by, the experience of Indigenous peoples in the country for the last year. It's been a really tough year for Canadians across the board, but, Indigenous peoples have paid an incredibly high emotional and traumatic price with the sequence of events that have happened, whether it's the Kamloops 2015, ongoing environmental racism battles against extractive industries and pipeline fights in the West, and a renaissance of mining exploding across northern Canada, as well as mega hydro. All of these huge elements of Canada's extractive industry-based economy, Indigenous peoples pay a double-edged blade price in terms of the environmental, social consequences externalized on local communities by both provincial players and the private sector corporations they're playing with, and the silence of the federal government. Meanwhile, Canada, continues to present itself internationally as a champion of Indigenous rights, as a climate champion. All the while, we're seeing, things like the critical infrastructure, or the critical, hold on a second, where is it here? The critical minerals strategy, that takes in no consideration about what's actually critical in this country right now during a climate crisis, which is clean water, intact forests, and healthy communities, and not corporate profits. And we see this as well in the energy sector, in terms of, again, costs being externalized on local communities. When Indigenous communities continue to face the hugest impacts in regards to climate change and the unpredictable, violent climate weather related events that continue to escalate with Canada's lack of action. I think that what's really important to understand is that colonization caused climate change, and that, whatever Canada is doing in terms of economic or political actions related to the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this is inextricably tied to Canada's action on climate change and the economic reorganizing of Canada's economic system. Indigenous peoples are facing a climate emergency at a scale that is disproportionate to everyone else in our economy, and they need to be invested in, in a very big way to make it through this recession, because we've seen the austerity agenda and its consequences of the federal government and what that has created in terms of social crisis in our communities that is ongoing. Indigenous peoples need an opportunity to build, and the whole conversation about a just transition bill, piece of legislation, I think is something that this next Parliament needs to seriously consider and take action on. And certainly social movements are going to continue to exert pressure on a Just Transition Act and a suite of legislation that ensures that Indigenous peoples and the 94 recommendations related to the TRC are a big part of this big conversation that all Canadians need to be having. And I think that it's only through social movement pressure on a grand scale on MPs, in Parliament, in Ottawa, and across the country over, that's going to see the kind of changes that we need to see and ensure that the right people are sitting at the table, influencing and pushing decision makers to do the right thing.
Thank you very much, Clayton, for that context and your perspective. Leah, last time we spoke with you on Off the Hill in December, you were in the midst of a crisis in Winnipeg concerning missing and murdered Indigenous women, and you were waiting to speak with the Prime Minister. Now that you're returning to Parliament, what are the pressing and urgent items on your agenda?
Well, it's not a current crisis. It's been an ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in the city of Winnipeg, and certainly across the country, noting that the former Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations likened Winnipeg as ground zero for MMIWG2S in the country. And coming back into Parliament in this session, I'm going to continue pushing this matter of MMIWG2S. There was 231 calls for justice. The federal government came out just before the Human Rights Report, the day before the Human Rights Watch put out a report noting the ongoing systemic human rights violations against Indigenous people rooted in colonization and continuing on, noted that they were appointing, as somebody I have deep respect for, Jennifer Rattray, former director for the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, to oversee the potential implementation of Call to Justice 1.7, which would be human rights oversight, and an independent ombudsperson to oversee the government's response to the ongoing genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, to find out it's a feasibility study for calls for justice, 231 calls for justice that the government committed to implementing. We are ground zero in Winnipeg. We go missing and murdered without a trace. The most recent serial killer is not the first. And in the midst of all of this, this is not the first time in Winnipeg history where we've heard about women being suspected to be located in landfills. I want to highlight Tanya Nepanak, 2012. Tanya Nepanak, suspected to have been placed in the Brady landfill, 6 days, 2012, between October, I believe, October 6th and 12th. They search for her, and the search, never hear about it again. This is an ongoing issue. This is an ongoing issue of the normalization of genocide against Indigenous women and girls. So normalized that garbage continues to be placed on the human remains of Indigenous women and girls in real time. I'm currently preparing a submission for the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who is scheduled to have a visit in Canada. You know, Clayton pointed out many human rights violations against Indigenous people. This is certainly one that is very close to home in Winnipeg Centre. But I can tell you this, guaranteed livable basic income, a bill that I have put forward, a motion I put forward in the last Parliament, a bill that I put forward in this session, Bill 223, call for justice 4.5 to implement a guaranteed livable basic income for Indigenous people and all other Canadians. We need to remember that the women that have currently gone missing and murdered, they were living in sheltered, unhoused, in poverty. We need a guaranteed livable basic income immediately. It will save lives. We need immediate investment into affordable, accessible social housing with rent geared to income, something that the government continues to underfund in the city of Winnipeg and across the country. Those two human rights to give enough for the women that have recently perished to live in dignity. We may have seen them alive today. So I lift up the families in their ongoing advocacy, and all families and all women that have survived violence to finally receive justice in Winnipeg and throughout Canada.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you for continuing to fight for these important issues on Parliament Hill. Turning to Karl now. Karl, as a longtime and keen observer of Parliament, we've never had anything like the supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberals before in federal history. How has it been working? Will it last until 2025, the full term of this current government?
Well, in general, from a certain distance, I think it's actually been working pretty well. And Leah's closer to it, then she could correct me. And from the inside, it hasn't been in force all that long, and it's supposed to be in force all the way to 2025. But I think if we have an election earlier than 2025, it's unlikely to be because the NDP decides to withdraw support from the government and votes on the same side as the Conservatives and the Bloc. It's more likely that the Liberals will try to find a reason to trigger an election because they see some benefit to it as a matter of political strategy. So, you know, and I think that would be too bad. I mean, what I like about this is that it respects it respects the democratic choice of the people, even with first past the post that tends to create a lot of artificial majorities. We didn't get that in the last election or the previous one. The Canadian people chose multiple parties to represent them. And the idea that they should always be jockeying for position and looking for winners and losers, rather than looking to how to make the people the winners out of our government. And the idea that everybody, all 338 members of parliament, are members of parliament who are supposed to govern. And we're not just supposed to have a kind of rubber stamp government that allows the cabinet and party operatives to make all the decisions behind closed doors, and we have this useless theater of parliament. So I think it is a good idea to do this. By the way, this is the only time federally we've had this kind of governing arrangement, but two provinces did it, Ontario in the 1980s and very recently the John Horgan government in British Columbia governed with an arrangement, similar arrangement, where the Green Party was the minority partner in British Columbia. So we, I mean, if we were ever to adopt an electoral system that had some proportionality to it, you'd never get majorities, or very unlikely to, and you'd have to come up with some idea of governing, which mostly in countries in Europe, when they have that system, they have coalitions where the multiple parties who are members of the coalition, they all sit in the cabinet. We didn't have that. We didn't go for that this time. I don't know whether either the NDP or the Liberals might have wanted it. I know that Jack Layton would have liked to have be invited to into a coalition way back with Paul Martin. He said so publicly, and Martin just contemptuously said, "You haven't got enough members to put me over the top, so it's not worth my while. Why bother putting you in a coalition?" On the other hand, I know that David Lewis and Tommy Douglas, way back, early leaders of the NDP, when it morphed out of the CCF, used to say that Trudeau tried to sucker them into some kind of an arrangement in their mind, a coalition or something, because in those days, the NDP had support in Western Canada, and the Liberals had very few seats, if any, in Western Canada. And he wanted to get their Western Canadian seats, and they said, "No way, we'll just be gobbled up by the Liberals." It's interesting, but from David Lewis or Tommy Douglas to Jack Layton, the philosophy changed. The idea that parties should share power and talk to each other and cooperate and collaborate, what's wrong with that? I mean, if we were talking about people, human beings, neighbors, other human beings, we say that's a good idea. Why should politicians always want to kill each other? Why should politicians always want to win all the time and destroy the other person or destroy the other party? Now, we are in a different political environment. I remember the days when you had conservative parties headed by guys like Stanfield and Joe Clark and John Diefenbaker. That's not the Pierre Poilievre conservatives. In those days, the NDP could really find common cause from time to time with either the Liberals or Conservatives, even in Brian Mulroney's time. That's not true now. So the NDP's pretty much put its cards on the table and said, we can cooperate with the Liberals. The chances of us finding anything we would agree with the Conservatives on to form any kind of partnership is very little, although there is one thing that the NDP and Conservatives do agree on today, and that is they both oppose the merger of Shaw and Rogers, so the takeover of Shaw by Rogers. So there is, interestingly enough, these populist Conservatives are kind of against, they say they are anyway, they don't mean it, but sometimes they mean it. They're against big corporate power. Similarly, they're not very happy with the airlines, and they want to see a much stronger passenger bill of rights. So there are a few times that, believe it or not, where you could get a bit of a cooperation. But I take to heart Jim's warning that we have hard economic times coming, and you could have a populist right-wing backlash against it. And we've had that in other parts of the world. We had it in France, not entirely successful. In Sweden, the home of, the great home of social democracy, the far right is in power now. In Italy, the far right is in power now. So it is scary because we have an official opposition that is a scary far right populist party, but it's managing these days. They've gone into the tailor shop and they said, "Please sew us up a sheep's suit. We want to put that sheep's suit on," and they're wearing that sheep's suit now, and they're talking nice talk about ordinary people and their cost of living and stuff like that. But those of us who lived through the Harper government know they don't mean it. So I don't know how much more to say.
No, thanks, Karl. Leah, you got some thoughts on is the agreement between the NDP and the Liberals working?
Well, I know certainly with the child care legislation, it's coming up for debate again. That was one of the central parts of the confidence and supply agreement. I was really proud as the critic to be a part of the negotiations on that bill. And, part of the reason why in the bill it talks about ensuring that childcare spaces are public and not for profit in terms of any sort of, the bilateral agreements will stay as they are right now, but any bilateral agreements going forward will ensure that new childcare spaces are public and not for profit. That was a huge win. That was a win by the NDP, ensuring that The legislation was compatible with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. These are huge wins from the NDP. I don't think if we didn't have the confidence and supply agreement, I would have had the ability as the critic to work on that legislation to improve it. Now it's up for debate. It's certainly not perfect, but we will have an opportunity at the committee stage to make other amendments. And I know, certainly advocates and unions for a national child care strategy, top advocates and leaders in the field across the country and unions are very much happy with this legislation. So I think that was a real win. A win that is often not spoken about, but certainly something that the NDP, in fact, has been fighting for 30 years, a national, public, not-for-profit universal child care system. And so, I think that's a win. It's certainly not perfect, but I think that's certainly one of the wins that we can highlight.
All right, thanks, Leah. All right. Go on to our next question here. And this will be a question actually for everybody. So it has just been revealed that a video will soon be released of 5 Memphis police officers viciously beating a Black man, Tyre Nichols, who later died, if that video is not already up. So with Black History Month starting in less than a week, 2020's global Black Lives Matter outrage and protest and calls to defund seemed like they were distant memories until this happened. Now, that said, 2022 did see some important steps in the right direction. In October, Quebec Superior Court released the landmark Loamba racial profiling decision, declaring it unconstitutional for police to stop any driver without cause. So that was good. And in November, the federal government passed Bill C-5, which repealed mandatory sentences for drug and tobacco offenses, many of which had fueled overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in prison. So the question to all would be, how can we maintain visibility and action on systemic anti-Black racism, specifically and racial justice issues more broadly in 2023? And that's especially with the strong push against all equity-seeking groups shown by the massive popularity of people like the former U of T professor Jordan Peterson. Why don't we start with Clayton?
So what, I heard the narrative, but what's the actual question you're asking?
The question was, how can we maintain visibility and action on systemic anti-Black racism and racial justice issues more broadly in 2023?
Well, Canada is a really challenging place to have a conversation about anti-racism and dismantling systemic racism and all the manifestations of that. Because our population demographic, it's like 80+%, European presenting or white presenting. So for a lot of people, I think that, it's out of sight, out of mind, and until racism and systemic racism and violence against brown and Black people, especially violence against Indigenous women, become a white issue, I think we'll continue to have the kind of problems of erasure that we see. In terms of the life cycle of escalated moments. I think that, one can only look at the lack of news around the fact that these unmarked graves across the country at Canada's 100+ residential schools has surpassed 10,000 with the recent discoveries of more unmarked graves at Canada's Indian residential school sites. And, it's crazy that this isn't all over the news and that, this isn't, an issue where cities are being shut down by people, who are concerned about, the injustices of the past. And I think that that's where, there needs to be a lot of much more, I think, convening of spaces for people to come together, because Canada continues to get let off the hook. And when we look at, racial justice through the lens of, I think, the Canadian experience, brown and Black people, continue to pay the highest price in terms of, the lack of attention. One only has to look at the migrant workers who have been taking action over status for all. Like so many of our workers who provide food security for our economy that come from outside of our economy can't even access basic health care. And it's a massive promise that, Trudeau made to that community to give them status, within Canada. And it's just not happening. And, and I think that this kind of erasure continues to be nothing new, to our communities. And that's where I think that, solidarity now more than ever is critical between social movements and those intersections of social movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Indigenous rights, the fight for justice over Canada's, Indian residential school genocide and the ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls. These are all fundamentally tied to Canada's unsustainable economic paradigm, and why I advocate very strongly that, whatever Canada does on truth and reconciliation, on, dismantling, white supremacy and systemic racism in this country, that these actions need to be tied to the discourse around decolonization and around reparations, and we need to move away from, hollow promises, and actually start talking about, the fact that colonization caused climate change. And as we engage in the restructuring of Canada's economy, there are certain communities that need to be invested in, as we transition, off of a fossil fuel economy and into something that, builds community self-determination over things like water and sanitation, energy, and so on and so forth. And I think that, there's a lot of ways that people can get involved, by really, putting pressure on your MPs, whether it's over the issue of status for all or over the issue of ongoing, investment in unsustainable projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline or the Coastal GasLink project. And I think that communities need to get politicized over, just all of these economic schemes, whether it's false climate solutions or the mining renaissance. We need to make sure that, we have a strategy that, leaves no worker and that takes communities into consideration as we, build the largest social movement in the history of humankind to deal with climate change. And a couple of things I would just leave with folks is that, 350, the good team at 350 Canada is organizing an op-ed, action where you can pressure your member of parliament over the just transition legislation that Canada needs to implement. There's also support that you can throw behind, the fossil fuel treaty ban. The work, good people at Stand are pushing that work. I think it's really important and critical work for Canada to collaborate with countries that have signed and support the fossil fuel treaty ban. And I think that, having conversations in the workplace, about truth and reconciliation, about Canada's Indian residential schools and murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and bringing these issues into conversations in community about community self-determination and power. These are the kinds of convenings and pulling together that we need to have. And I think that we really need to demonstrate a lot of compassion and patience for each other in the country, in the year to come. And especially for Indigenous folks, because they're really having a hard time. We never get a chance to breathe and to get creative, because we're always dealing with the impacts of the federal government's austerity agenda in our communities. We got to move away from that.
I just like to add to that. First, I just want to take just a shout out to one MP here. I did put out a statement in support of status for all today. It's that's certainly an issue that the federal government has failed on, a fundamental issue of justice. But here's the thing: we have a growing white nationalist movement in this country. Full stop. Peterson, you mentioned Peterson, every profession has a professional code of conduct. he breached that code of conduct. We now have a leader of the Conservative Party, a residential school denialist from 2008, apologizing for his own residential school denial, fraternizing with the Frontier Center in Winnipeg last week, fundraising, in fact, with the Frontier Center, one of the lead residential school denialists, homophobic, anti-LGBTQIA, saying the biggest struggle right now is for, struggling white males, fraternizing with them, all in the name of freedom of speech. He put out a tweet the other day, and I responded he said, when I'm Prime Minister, First Nations will keep more of the resources, revenues generated on their lands instead of sending it to gatekeepers in Ottawa, talking about this rhetoric of gatekeepers when Pierre Poilievre has consistently in every single parliament voted against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which includes voting against the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people. That hanging out with residential school denialists or handing out coffee and donuts to known hate leaders, Patrick King during the convoy, a convoy that I had to walk through to get to work, putting what I feel, although has been named peaceful, I would say it was anything but. When you have leaders of mainstream political parties fraternizing with white nationalists, fraternizing with residential school deniers, fraternizing with leaders of convoy that were funded in large part by the alt-right wing in the United States, this is deeply troubling. And he is smooth. Pierre Poilievre is smooth, but there's one thing to be smooth, and then I have to look at the facts. And those are the facts. And I think if there was ever a time in Canadian history where our democracy was under threat, we want to talk about freedom, we want to talk about democracy, it's when you have leaders that fuel hate and fraternize with hate leaders and will do anything to gain power. And that is what is happening right now. I have lost sleep over it. And I think we need to be vigilant and be mindful, pay attention, and listen. That's
All right,
it.
thank you.
That was my rant. I feel
Thank
better.
you.
It was like a healing journey. Thank you.
No problem. Over to Nick.
All right, so we're going to go to another question. Thank you very much, Leah, and to all panelists for this informative discussion. Our first audience question is, how much should we be concerned about how tough economic times may fuel the anti-equity movement led by people like, people like Jordan Peterson? I guess, because it's an economic question, would we like to go to Jim?
Oh, thank you for that question. Thank you for that rant, Leah. We need more rants like that, believe me. So that was wonderful. It's another reason why I'm so fearful of a really negative downturn in the economy and the labor market. And it's the mere opposite of some incremental progress that we've seen in different ways over the last couple of years when the labor market was a lot stronger. The unemployment rate today is 5%. That's not full employment by any stretch of the imagination, and it's certainly not a labor shortage. I reject that idea completely. That's a totally neoliberal concept, the idea that labor is a supply and we just need to get more of it to solve our problems. In fact, full employment is a good thing, not a bad thing. Getting a situation where everyone who wants to work can, and the closer you get to it, the more chance there is for people who are traditionally marginalized from labor market opportunities, including obviously racialized Canadians, women, young people, people with disabilities, people in rural and remote regions. When the unemployment rate falls and employers have to finally do something to try and recruit and retain labor, rather than just sitting back and wait for a steady stream of desperate people to come to their door, then that's when those groups finally have a chance to make some progress. And we have seen that in different statistics over the last 2 years. Now we've got the Bank of Canada Governor, Mr. Macklem, saying the quiet bits out loud, saying explicitly 5% unemployment is too low and we have to get it higher. What, 6%, 7%? Well, he's going to get his wish because we're gonna have some kind of a recession, an engineered recession that he plays a big part in bringing about. And it's not just a number; it's human beings and the evaporation of their life chances when, particularly, racialized Canadians, women, young people, people with disabilities, people in rural and remote regions can't get decent jobs. So we are going to see, as always, recessions are very disequalizing, and people who have less life chances in modern capitalism always bear the brunt of it. So we'll see an economic injustice in this recession, and then we'll see a political threat, as Leah and others have pointed out. This white nationalist sentiment that's out there will start to blame immigrants, blame people of color for the unemployment that everyone's experiencing, and we'll see again more fuel on the fire of that horrible racism that we are already experiencing. So many reasons to be very concerned about this coming economic moment.
Can I just jump in for a second? And
Sure,
I don't
Karl.
want to take over. I don't want to take over from our interviewers, but I just want to ask Jim for a positive prescription. If you were in charge of fiscal policy now, and you and the governor of the Bank of Canada had to listen to you, even though he's monetary policy, what would you do instead of jacking up interest rates to bring down inflation? I mean, just quickly say, I remember way back in the 70s, I'm so old, we had wage and price controls back in Justin Trudeau's father's time, but we never hear talk about any alternative. It's come to be the urban legend that there is only one way to deal with inflation, and that is to raise interest rates, which is anti-intuitive. I remember asking people who are looking for a job, why would that be a way of lowering something? Because you're raising the price of something. And of course, what you're doing is you're just making people poorer. You're making some people poorer. The people who have a lot of money, and it's going to cost them a lot more money to buy mink coats, well, they'll buy fewer mink coats. But the people who have very little and they have debts. And I guess that's another question. Why do we have such a high level of indebtedness compared to 40 years ago when I was in debt? Pretty high. But what would you do? How would you confront the issue, assuming that inflation is a real issue that we can't just ignore? How would you confront it other than jacking up interest rates?
Oh, great question, Karl. Even though you're out on a limb asking an economist to say something positive, we have a reputation as the dismal science, and these days it's very well deserved. In terms of the positive alternative, what could we do differently? I do want to refer our listeners tonight to a joint paper that we published with the Canadian Labour Congress and the Centre for Future Work in October, and I'll send the link around in the chat. That does exactly that. It's got a 6-point strategy for tackling inflation that would be fairer. And one of them is precisely to regulate some of the key prices that led the surge in inflation. All out wage and price controls may be hard economically and politically, but certainly there's key strategic commodities that you could set price caps on, and that would have short-circuited the whole inflationary surge that we saw. Energy is an obvious one there. There's no reason why we should double the price that we pay for Canadian-produced energy just because of something that happened on the global futures markets, allegedly because of something that happened in Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't produce oil, and there was no change in oil supply and demand balances globally. It was all about fear and speculation and financialization in global markets that explains why suddenly we're paying so much more for energy, and that was the largest single contributor to our inflation. Housing is another no-brainer. Some provinces, like BC, where I am, have rent controls, thank goodness, but they're not strong enough, and we've seen a huge surge in rents. In fact, that higher interest rates impact has actually made rents more expensive because there's a surge of people into the rental market because people can't afford to buy a house anymore. So there are ways you could use price controls. There are ways that you could have a more targeted monetary and credit policy that restricted access to credit in areas that aren't useful, like home speculation, financialized activities, stock market. bubbles, etc., but still supplied low price credit in places where we do need it, including public infrastructure and housing construction. We have to support low-income Canadians and working Canadians to keep up with inflation, and I reject the idea that that itself causes inflation. Something like a good old-fashioned COLA clause, that was another thing from that era that you were referring to, Karl, where your wages adjust automatically based on how fast prices were. That doesn't lock in inflation. That just protects you against inflation while it's occurring. Then, if the original causes of inflation, like that energy price surge that I was talking about, ease off, then wage growth eases off as well. So you're quite right about the urban myth that's out there about wage price spirals, and the only thing we can do is raise interest rates. There are a whole range of different alternatives that could have been implemented. Unfortunately, we kind of, the people in charge went back to their old 1970s recipe book and are applying it without mercy right now. And this is the situation that we're facing.
Thank you for that, Jim. We've got another question coming in, shifting gears a bit, and anyone can take this one. Q5 coming in from Judy Rebick. We are also facing a healthcare crisis. What do you think that the federal provincial agreement should be?
Can I jump in, because I just wrote about that this week?
Sure, Karl. Yeah.
I think the real crisis, Doug Ford wants you to believe, is the real crisis in healthcare is that we don't have private companies. We don't outsource surgeries to private companies, and some of that would increase the supply of surgeries if we use the same actual personnel, doctors and nurses who now work in hospitals, but somehow also have them working in private companies. Well, I mean, his math is not very good. If you have the same number of people performing surgeries, but having to perform them in two different places, it's not going to increase the number of surgeries. It's just going to create a shortage in one place or the other. But the real crisis in healthcare is the fact that, in Ontario, something like 1.7 million people don't have family doctors. It's a crisis of primary care. There was an excellent report that came out by the Public Policy Forum a few days ago, authored partly by Jane Philpott, the former Minister of Health. And that's what we have to be looking at. Is they talk a lot about working in teams. We've got to have some way of guaranteeing every single Canadian access to primary health care, what we used to call, what they were always told, call your doctor. If you feel symptoms, call your doctor. To the millions of Canadians who don't have a doctor, that's an insult. And so what we have to say is consult your primary care team, not call your doctor. And every Canadian should have access to primary care, and mostly should be in a teamwork situation where you have nurses, doctors, other medical professionals, nutritionists, social workers, sometimes, and various other people working together, and doctors have to work together. We have to stop turning doctors into little entrepreneurs, where a family doctor has to pay his rent or her rent or their rent, and has to have a secretary and a staff, and is running a business. A doctor should be not running a business. A doctor should be providing medical service. And that is really the keystone of a reform. There's many other things that the system can do better, of course, but that is the starting point, is a major reform of primary care, and mostly moving away from the individual doctor offering primary care in his own or her own or their own private practice on a fee-for-service basis. So that's my 2 cents about the health agreement.
No, thank you for that. Does anybody else want to jump in on healthcare before we go to the next question? Go on. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I would just want to mention that, that there is a crisis in healthcare in this country. And I think, again, just to name it, it gets particularly acute when we talk about Northerners' access to, things like critical surgeries or just day-to-day healthcare. Here in my own province of Manitoba, there continues to be just, situation after circumstance where Indigenous peoples, either die, with not being able to access, critical health care, or, just don't have the accessibility because of geography and where the communities are and the lack of healthcare infrastructure in those communities. Even simple things as the province contracting out, flying of people who need healthcare from the north to the city, and those services, being very challenging, because of their private sector placement. There's a lot there. When we talk about racism within Canada's healthcare system, and Indigenous peoples, and migrants, immigrants, we face a disproportionate challenge on top of I think what everybody faces. And so again, we need to make these issues more widely talked about, especially with decision makers. And we need solidarity from all Canadians, to level the playing field as far as how we negotiate what the healthcare system of the future is going to look like.
Okay, thanks, Clayton. All right, we've got kind of going back to the economy, but specifically the idea of just transition. So this says, can Jim Stanford speak to why a just transition is so important, especially considering so many people believe a just transition equals job destruction? So Jim, if you can speak to that, and then if Leah and Clayton after that can talk a bit about, just get some details around what a green transition for Indigenous peoples looks like. So let's start with Jim first.
Sure, thanks, Robin. That terminology, just transition, has kind of blown up a bit. You've seen Danielle Smith and the others in Alberta tilting at windmills with this infamous memo from the federal government that supposedly reveals secret plans to destroy the oil industry. It's a bunch of nonsense. And frankly, I've always been cautious about even the term just transition, because it does sound like somebody's coming for you. It makes it sound like you're going to lose something, but we'll take care of you. And I think in a way it was well intentioned. In fact, my old union, part of it was with Unifor, the former Communication Energy Paper Union, helped to invent that terminology. But I try to use other words, about a planned transition or a supported transition, or the idea that you can facilitate the shift in employment from fossil fuel jobs to other jobs without any kind of involuntary unemployment or major displacement. We've done some work through our center on this. First of all, challenging the propaganda you get from the oil industry about how supposedly important their industry is. It is much less important than they claim. Less than 1% of Canadians have direct work in any type of fossil fuel industry, and that share has been falling already. Secondly, there's so many different ways to support adjustment as the industry shrinks. If we were to phase out fossil fuels over the next 20 years, you've got lots of time to take care of that less than 1% of the direct workforce, whether that's moving into renewable energy jobs, other types of sustainable resource or construction or industry jobs, or jobs anywhere else in the rest of the economy, including education, healthcare, and other sectors that are desperate for workers, or retirement, or relocation. And the experience of other places like Germany, when they phased out black coal mining without a single job loss, if you put enough time notice in and support for people to pursue any of those options. We don't say, someone who works in the tar sands has to go and make windmills. You don't have to move people like they're poker chips that way. We can say, we'll give a 20-year timetable, create targets and stick to the targets, and then the task becomes very manageable. And we could commit the just transition plan I would like to see, and this is what I've argued in submissions to the federal government on it, make a commitment that no one will lose their job involuntarily in the course of this transition. We could absolutely do that with a puny amount of financial support every year over the next 20 years. And I think that would change the politics of it. So it is absolutely economically possible. In fact, it will be economically beneficial to put people in better sustainable jobs and support them in that movement.
Thanks, Jim. And yeah, Clayton and Leah, can you talk about, again, although Jim's kind of gave us a bit more meter on that term, just transition, but in terms of for Indigenous people, what is a just transition, transition to a green economy? Can you give us more details around what that would look like?
I can go first, and I think this is Clayton's life work, and so I'd like to give him the final word. I just think it's important to understand Indigenous people have diverse perspectives, even in terms of this area, what's a just transition. I just want to because of work that I've been working on in the House of Commons. You know, we just finished a study in the Status of Women Committee about the connection between resource extraction and increased violence against Indigenous women and girls, unanimously supported by all the recommendations, unanimously supported across all party lines. Because at the root of this, whether it's violence against our lands, has also resulted in violence against our women and girls, where we see increased amounts of violence, including things like sex trafficking. You know, we have companies that come into our communities without accountability. We have companies that come into Indigenous communities, start reaping the benefits of the resources, and don't even follow the agreements that they have set out with nations. You know, one of the things that our report called on is that if companies are to come in our communities, they need to consult with the First Nation. They need to make sure that there are safety plans put in place for the women and girls. You know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one of the founding rights is that Indigenous people have a right to free, prior, and informed consent. So I think a bigger discussion right now, when we're talking about, we have leaders talking about the freest place on earth, is to honor the freedom of Indigenous people to have the to obtain our free, prior, and informed consent over decisions that impact our lands and territories, and the impacts that it has knowingly when it starts, or unknowingly, on the increased violence against Indigenous women and girls. You know, they have destroyed many of our lands. They have left us homeless on our own lands, going to cities often. Many Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people homeless on our own lands. So we want to talk about resource sector. We have to respect the sovereignty Indigenous peoples have over their lands and territories, and the free, prior, and informed consent to respect that over any decisions that are made about any sort of developments that happen, or no development that happens on our lands.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts are, Canada's own Environment Commissioner reported that we've got the worst record as far as reducing emissions of all the G7 economies. And that's because of the oil and gas sector, who also have refused to clean up the trillion liters of leaking tailings ponds, poisoning communities downstream in Alberta. And, is climate justice possible in this country? Is a just transition possible? I think it is, but it's going to require that the Canadian government stand up to big oil. And they need to start making a plan to stop expansion of fossil fuel and manage a winding down that puts people, workers, and communities first. And I think that, fundamentally it means funding renewables and not more handouts to the industry for their carbon capture schemes and other false solutions that they're out there peddling. And it means subsidizing families to put in place heat pumps and solar panels, and, for people living in cities, making public transit affordable and accessible. And, and I think fundamentally, it means that our government has to stop arresting Indigenous leaders who are trying to stop new fossil fuel pipelines. And, I think the government in Canada needs to finally start listening to, Indigenous knowledge carriers and the things that we've been trying to share as far as climate mitigation and especially adaptation. We are the global experts on rapid adaptation because we were forced to learn how to be good at it. And this is something that I think Indigenous peoples bring to the table when we talk about a just transition and a reorganizing of Canada's economic model.
No, thank you, Clayton. And thank you to everybody. That is all the time we have for questions today. Thanks to our audience members for all your great questions and interventions. And thank you to all of you, to Leah, Jim, Clayton, Karl, for being part of another great conversation.
Thanks,
and
everybody.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for herding the cats.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. And thank you to my co-host, Nick, for stepping in. This time, that ends our first Off the Hill panel of 2023. Our live political panel series will return on February the 15th for a special Black History Month focused panel. Be sure to get an invitation to that by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, as always, we thank Rabble for creating a space to host these great conversations. And on that note, Rabble is running a fundraiser right now, and we encourage you to support that and events like this by donating to rabble.ca/donate. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and see you all next month.